What's up, everybody? Welcome back to a Tomatuito Boxing Show. Let's continue diving into the action that took place this past Saturday night. Just as Jaime Munguia was getting ready to step into the ring against his challenger, Frenchman Bruno Sarasi, and we know how that turned out. We covered it in the last episode. 2 hours northeast of Tijuana, Mexico, in the U.S., in Ontario, California, we had the final Golden Boy card of 2024, and it was headlined by two welterweights. Alexis Rocha, who is the NABO champion for the WBO, and then the North American champion for the WBC in El Cougar, Raul Curiel. A lot of animosity, a lot of disdain for one another. In the lead-up, Alexis Rocha mentions to Curiel that he knows that Curiel is not at his level. Both very experienced fighters. In Rocha, maybe a little bit more experience and a little bit more seasoned as it relates to the professional ranks. And for Curiel, who's undefeated himself, Rocha stepping into the ring with 2 defeats. Curiel, unblemished record with a really high level pedigree as it relates to his amateur experience, having represented the Mexican national boxing team prior to turning pro. So yes, both very, very experienced fighters as it relates to their talents atop the squared circle. Raul Curiel stepped into the ring with a 15-0 record, 13 knockouts to his credit. And the biggest victories that he had to date had to be journeyman Brad Solomon a few fights back. Jorge Marron, his last fight, his previous fight, a 20-4 with 2 draw record for Jorge Marron, where Raul Curiel knocks him out in the first round. That fight secured him this showdown with Alexis Rocha. Rocha stepping into the ring with a 25-2 record, 16 knockouts to his credit. One of those 2 losses was by way of stoppage. He had a unanimous decision loss 4 years ago to Rashidi Ellis. And then he had that knockout stoppage loss in round 6 at the hands of Giovanni Santillan. Let me give you guys a little something, because those of you that follow me on YouTube and could see the interviews that I conduct on YouTube a week prior to this fight taking place, I actually sat down with Giovanni Santillan. Now, what I want to touch on is that you guys hear me, and you guys heard me on the previous broadcast when I was calling the fights live, the last 3 fights of the Oscar Valdez Navarrete card for Top Rank. The night prior, I got to sit and talk to Giovanni Santillan. Now, the issue with those videos, I ended up switching cameras and went live. This happened on the road to the fights. Had about a 2.5, 3 hour drive. Made it there, made the quick adjustments, and started recording. And started getting to talk to boxers and get those interviews for you guys. Lo and behold, when I'm doing post and I'm editing and I'm looking to see what's salvageable, what's good, what's not, and so forth, I do my best to post raw content for you guys. Raw, unedited content. And the only thing that I'll usually add will be the banners, or if there's some sound issues, then I'll try to address that if possible. But if not, for the most part, everything you guys see, 98%, 99% of it, what you guys see is exactly as I recorded it And that's my intention with the channel, to bring you guys behind the scenes, fresh, raw footage. So I'm not going to hold out on you guys, because I thought those were really good interviews that were conducted with Shushu Carrington, with Giovanni Santillan. And the reason that I'm focusing on Giovanni Santillan is because he's a big player in this welterweight division. He succumbed to the power of Brian Norman for the interim WBO title out in San Diego, and I happened to be there live as well. He was on the comeback on the undercard of Valdez Navarrete, and he came away with a victory over Frederick Lawson. Frederick Lawson, a former foe of Alexis Rocha, and a former foe of a fellow stablemate of Giovanni and Virgil Ortiz. So Robert Garcia, who trains and coaches Giovanni Santillan, had a very good plan for the way to approach a Frederick Lawson. And Giovanni Santillan is back on the win column. A lot of people didn't even pay attention to this. But if you go back, if you could see past the camera issues, the darkness of the video, and you could listen to the interview, it was a very good, solid, humble interview that Giovanni Santillan provided me with, including towards the end of the interview where he mentions that he had a recent passing of a family member, of someone close to him, and a former foe of his with the name of Alexis Rocha reaches out to him to lend his condolences. And I thought that was very neat that he was willing to share that. And that came about because I asked him that should he be victorious the following night against Frederick Lawson, if he was planning, since he's based out of San Diego area, he trains out in Moreno Valley, he's not going to be that far from the Ontario area, maybe 45 minutes to an hour drive. If he was going to be on hand to go witness Alexis Rocha against Raul Curiel, to be able to scout potential future opposition as he's trying to get back into the win column and continue climbing that ladder towards the title. He was right there. It was in his grasp. But he decided to exchange fire with Brian Norman, and you saw what Brian Norman was able to do to him. So he mentioned that he was not going to be attending the fight, but he did make the anecdote and share the anecdote with Alexis Rocha having reached out to him. And I thought that was very neat. So check out that interview if you have a chance, up on the YouTube channel. And I apologize for the camera issues, but like I said, I'm learning as I go, and thanks to you guys that continue to support the channel, that continue to help me grow the channel, continue to spread the word about the channel, that is opening doors for me. And if you guys look back at this calendar year, I gave you guys my word that we were going to go balls to the wall this year, and we did. We started with Golden Boy and Jaime Munguia, and we closed out with Top Rank with Valdez and Navarrete. I managed to get to Vegas. Matchroom opened their doors for me. Del Sol Boxing Promotions, a local organization out in Phoenix, they opened their doors to me. Multiple Golden Boy events, multiple Top Rank events. And we're going to continue bringing you the best possible footage that I can get my hands on. So I really appreciate, I thought that I needed to do justice to Giovanni Santillan, and he gave me a really good interview, and then I end up with that camera issue being a very, very dark, and as it was a very dark room, but most of the lighting was obviously towards the stage during the weigh-ins and towards the big TV networks that were hosting there, so everything else was pretty much dimmed out. So you have to be on your A game with your own personal lighting, and the fact that I didn't pay attention to that ahead of time ends up not doing justice to Giovanni Santillan in that light. But as far as the audio, it's pretty impeccable, and it's pretty cool that it's in a live setting. So check that out. And it's important because Giovanni Santillan, getting back into the win column 1 week prior to Alexis Rocha and Raul Curiel, is keeping tabs on this fight. And the fact that Alexis Rocha succumbed and was stopped by Giovanni Santillan, yet came into the ring against Raul Curiel with the WBO NABO title. That's the ticket to be able to challenge the champion of that division, which happens to now be Brian Norman Jr. Brian Norman Jr. was supposed to fight Derek Cuevas. He ended up pricing himself out in a fight in a unification bout with Boots Ennis. Then he ends up getting injured and his fight with Derek Cuevas falls through. And now it looks like that fight might happen around the first quarter against his mandatory challenger, Derek Cuevas. First quarter of 2025. Boots Ennis goes on to fight Karen Chukazian and not look very good in doing so, but managed to get his hand raised in victory and retain his title. And that's something that we talked about in the prior episode, that when you have certain opponents or mandatories, you're on A game when you're trying to climb up the ladder and you're fighting all the top contenders to try to get to that title. And when you manage to get the title and you start getting the lesser known fighters or unknown fighters, they're hungry. They're looking to take the throne away from you and get their hands on the belt. But for you, you get to that title, you get to the top of the peak, to the pinnacle of the division, hoping to land the big money marketable fights, and then you have to fight somebody that nobody knows about, including yourself as a fighter. And it's hard to wake up for that in training. And fighters have mentioned this through and through, and we've witnessed it. We witnessed it on this very same night with Bruno Surasi stopping Jaime Munguia. We witnessed it with Boots, who nearly, who made a fight tougher for himself than it should have been in what was a rematch with Karen Chukazian. He ended up handling Karen Chukazian in a lot easier of a manner in their first showdown. Yet Chukazian made the necessary adjustments and actually was getting and connecting and getting on the inside of Boots. And Boots didn't look that great. And we've seen it happen time and again. So we get to Alexis Rocha and Raul Curiel as it relates to this big fight that was taking place. Alexis Rocha, not yet a household name, but we know that he's got all the promise to be able to get to the top and challenge the top champions, especially right now in the welterweight division that's a little bit lighter. Alexis Rocha was always hopeful in trying to land a fight with Terence Crawford and challenge him for the title. Terence has since moved up to 154. So a fight with Brian Norman would be very, very realistic right now. And Alexis Rocha would end up being the bigger draw in that fight against a lesser known champion in Brian Norman. This was a very important fight. And for Raul Curiel, who's an undefeated fighter with a good following as far as the Mexican fan base, relatively known for having represented the country in their national team, making a name for himself through the Golden Boy banner, a victory over Alexis Rocha would be the biggest name in his resume. What ensued was a back and forth slugfest between these two guys who just had so much disdain and animosity towards one another that it ended up becoming an amazing fight. A very entertaining, great showing by both Alexis Rocha and Raul Curiel. And in the end, the judges took forever to render a decision and end up rendering a draw. Raul Curiel is now undefeated with a draw, and Alexis Rocha gets the first draw of his record as well. It was a very entertaining fight that if we were to see this run back between these two, they are so evenly matched. For Alexis Rocha to have mentioned that Raul Curiel is not at his level, it elevated the level that Raul Curiel and the urgency that Raul Curiel fought with. Amazing combinations by both fighters. Alexis Rocha kept attacking the body of Raul Curiel whenever possible, and usually to close out his combinations. He also countered to the body very well and got hit quite a bit. Raul Curiel, more of an offensive in-your-face type fighter with very good power and would actually complete his combinations and throw 4 or 5 punches at a time, finding high rates of success. In the end, we get a draw. The winners were us, the fans, because they left it all out there. And what a way to close out 2024 for both of these guys. A few minutes ago, since I'm mentioning to you that I got to talk to Giovanni Santillan, well, if we go back to early November, when I was out in Vegas covering the Floyd Schofield fight, I got to talk to Alexis Rocha for quite a bit. And that interview is also up on the YouTube channel. And he was looking forward to this fight. He was already mid-preparation and with his camp underway in preparation for Raul Curiel. And you guys could check that out as well on the YouTube channel if you haven't yet. Really good interviews with both of these fighters. And I wish I could have been there to this fight, at this fight live. And I didn't get the opportunity to do so. But we'll push forward to 2025. If these two get to run it back, it's going to be an even bigger event. Hands down. It's going to be a bigger event, and it's going to attract a lot bigger crowd because of how this first fight played out. It was just a back and forth slugfest where these guys landed every bit of power and emptied their tanks on one another. And if this would have been a 15-round fight, they still would have gone at each other. They are so evenly matched that it lent itself for an exciting showdown. Great body work by Alexis Rocha, great combinations, and good countering by Alexis Rocha. And for Raul Curiel, his offensive combinations, the way that he's able to infiltrate into the opponent's spacing, the way that he's willing to exchange in order to just land one punch and then ends up landing 5 punches, 3 punches, and throws in succession, in high rate succession, it's really fun to watch. Neither one of them were happy with the draw. Obviously, because they would have unified titles. Whoever would have gotten this would have unified 2 minority titles for 2 of the major boxing organizations within the welterweight division, which would have opened the door for either of them to either pursue Brian Norman Jr. or Mario Barrios. Barrios, of course, coming off that awesome, exciting fight that he had in a draw himself against Abel Ramos, the uncle of Jesus Mono Ramos, who campaigns at 154. Abel Ramos, a journeyman, veteran, welterweight boxer, gave Mario Barrios everything he could handle. They dropped each other. And that was another exciting fight that reminded me a lot, or this fight with Rocha and Curiel reminded me a lot of that one that we witnessed on the undercard of the Tyson Jake Paul card or event. So Mario Barrios, as a champion, found himself in a tough fight against Abel Ramos, veteran Abel Ramos. Boots found himself in a tough fight against Karen Chukazian. Brian Norman, injured, unable to defend his title, make his first defense against Derek Cuevas. And Imantas Estaniones, the WBA champ, has been basically inactive since his fight back in May against Gabriel Maestre, and was ordered mandatorily by the WBA to pursue or to abide by a purse bid against Giasov, who's an undefeated fighter himself, Uzbeki fighter, if I recall. And they ended up reaching a deal, and it looks like Imantas will be defending his WBA title against Giasov sometime around the spring of 2025. And that rounds everything out. The fact that these fights are being so highly contested, this fight didn't do much for the rankings within the welterweight division for either Rocha or Curiel, but it did elevate their level as it relates to marketability for both of these fighters. If they pursue an immediate rematch with one another, it's going to be a fan favorite, fan friendly type fight. But if they end up getting a shot at any of the champions, it's going to be a rough night for any of those champions. They know they're going to have their work cut out for them. I would like to see Alexis Rocha against Brian Norman. If Norman and Derek Cuevas does not happen, as they said that it was going to be postponed due to Norman's injury, Norman has now been calling out Boots. After pricing himself out the initial time, he's calling out Teofimo Lopez, which would be an easy fight to make since both of them are top-ranked fighters. Teofimo has announced time and again that he's willing to move up and wants to test the waters at welterweight. He wanted to go after Crawford. He's calling out Boots. Brian Norman is calling out Teofimo now. Of course, that would be a big payday, and he wants to give and welcome Teofimo into the welterweight division. Teofimo has all the talent in the world, but again, another fighter that abides and obliges by the mandatories but doesn't wake up for these lesser-known opponents and ends up making it longer nights than they should be. The last example of Teofimo was against Steve Claggett, where Teofimo could have had him out early in the fight, but he ends up fighting down to a certain extent to the level of his opponents. So for Teofimo, who's training out with Eddie Reynoso in the Canelo camp now, we'll see what version of Teofimo we see next when he decides to step into the ring. He was on hand at the Valdez Navarrete. I wish I could have gotten an interview with him, but he was just on the opposite side of the arena and I wasn't able to get over to him. You'll even hear me talking about, during one of the recordings that I have on there, I think it was Lindolfo Delgado that was fighting Marines. And as that fight's happening, I got a little distracted because Teofimo's dad is right in front on press row, and he's standing right in front of me. And my attention ended up going that way because I was looking at him and I'm like, I know this guy. And my attention got drawn out a little bit, and you'll hear me mention that on the recording of the Delgado Marines fight as I was calling that one. So Teofimo happened to be sitting on the opposite end of press row, and I wasn't able to get to him. It would have been cool to ask him because on that same night, on that same recording, he goes and talks as ESPN is interviewing him, and he says that the 3 fights that he wants is Boots, Tank, and Crawford. The week of the Valdez Navarrete fight, we heard Tank on his press conference with Lamont Roach announce that at the end of 25, he will walk away, step away from the world of boxing. And completely disappear. Doesn't want any involvement with management or training or anything. He just wants to step away and disappear from the world of boxing, from the business of boxing. So Teofimo wants one of his 3 dream fights to be Tank. He wants Boots, Tank, and Crawford in that order. Tank has Lamont Roach, who's a 130-pound champion for the WBA, Tank being the 135-pound champ. So they're going to fight at lightweight. Lamont Roach has a chance to become a 2-division champion, but of course, you'd be a dummy if you bet against Tank. 2 fighters who know each other very well from their amateur days. And we go off on a tangent about how everything is relating because everything's tying into one another. Alexis Rocha and Giovanni Santillan, I would love to see that fight again to see if Alexis Rocha has identified what went wrong in that fight against Giovanni Santillan, where he suffered the stoppage loss at the hands of Santillan. That fight catapulted Santillan to go on and face Brian Norman for the interim WBO belt at that time. Brian Norman since has been elevated to full status. And that all came about, all these champions, Mario Barrios, Stanionis, Boots, all of them came about becoming champions through interim titles and Terrence Crawford vacating by having moved up to 154. So the fact that all these fights are so highly contested shows you how the welterweight division at the moment is wide open and is there for anybody to take. Boots used to look like a boogeyman. After his last performance with Chukazian, he looks a lot more human, a lot more attainable. A tough task at that, and possibly the best welterweight of all the champions. But not by much. I would put Stanionis as the second toughest of the champions to Boots. I would put Barrios as the third. And then Brian Norman at the end, at the moment, because he hasn't defended the title once. He looked amazing against Santillan. Hasn't done anything since. Has been out since May. By the time that he gets back, he'll be pushing close to a year. He's got all the talent in the world. And all depends on how he looks in his next outing. If it does go through, if the fight does go through with Derek Cuevas, who's a 27-1 fighter, I believe, a very good fighter himself. All depends how Brian Norman looks, because he could easily just shoot himself to the top of the welterweight division as the main guy, as the toughest champion, as the one to beat. The fact that Santillan, and that's boxing math, Santillan succumbs to Brian Norman. Santillan stops Alexis Rocha. Alexis Rocha holds the NABO title, and in a draw with Raul Curiel, he could still get a shot at Brian Norman in 2025. And it would be a little play in that boxing math, like I mentioned, to see how Alexis Rocha would fare out against Brian Norman, because we know that traditional boxing math doesn't work like that. Just because Norman beat the guy that beat Rocha doesn't mean that Brian Norman would beat Rocha. It's all about styles and how they match up boxistically. Raul Curiel is going to give anybody headaches. I would love to see Raul Curiel get a shot at Mario Barrios, since he holds that small version of the WBC title, the North American Federation title, I believe it's called. He should get his shot against Mario Barrios. Raul Curiel would be really tough, and don't be surprised if he pulled the upset against Mario Barrios. He fights completely different than Abel Ramos. He fights completely different than the last few opponents that Mario Barrios has had. Barrios, of course, has faced the likes of Keith Thurman, Yordeni Sugas, Tank, very experienced, fights with a lot of heart, really good chin. He fought Maldana's brother as well, where he came out victorious on that fight. Raul Curiel just fights completely different than any of those fighters, and has very good pedigree that people are not giving him credit for. And he showed it against Alexis Rocha. That is the path for both of these fighters that I see if the immediate rematch doesn't happen between Rocha and Curiel and they decide to go their separate ways. It'd be interesting to see, now that Giovanni Santillan defeated Frederick Lawson, if that's a fight that they would be willing to make. Alexis Rocha trying to right the wrong and face off against the man that stopped him. Does it make sense? Not for Rocha, other than for personal reasons, but he holds a version of Brian Norman's title. I hope that's the route that he takes, that he pursues that fight, and to stay busy. Meanwhile, if he wants to entertain the Giovanni Santillan one, go for it. If he wants to run it back with Raul Curiel, go for it. But Alexis Rocha is one of those fighters that he doesn't really care about being strategic. He's going to take on any and all comers. He has that confidence to him, and he fights that way. He stands up to the challenge, and however things play out, they play out. He's not trying to be the strategic fighter, where we've already seen Brian Norman price himself out with Boots. We've already seen Boots not be able to unify with Stanionis for whatever reason. That fight was talked about mid-year, earlier this year, and then that never happened. He keeps chasing Crawford. Crawford's not even listening to him. So very interesting the way that that things are playing out in the welterweight division. And this was no exception. This was one of the best fights that we've seen out of this division, right next to Mario Barrios and Abel Ramos just a month prior. So a lot of good talent there. You got Rohan Polanco, who's an up-and-coming welterweight as well. Dominican fighter, undefeated. And then Giasov, like I mentioned, another undefeated fighter. He should be getting that shot at Stanionis. And we'll see if Stanionis will be able to defend, or if he's going to succumb to Giasov. Giasov has a victory over Stanionis in the amateur ranks. Other fights that took place on the undercard of Rocha and Curiel. For the women, Marlon Sparsa got back to the win column as she defeated Areli Musino. And then a lot of up-and-coming talent that were featured there. Gael Cabrera, a young fighter that I got to speak to, that I got to interview earlier in the year. He was slated to fight in August. It didn't happen. He was supposed to fight in September. It didn't happen. He was supposed to fight in October in Indio. That didn't happen. Then he was supposed to fight the following week under undercard of Floyd Schofield. That didn't happen. He finally got back to the ring. He's a fighter that told me that he would like to have 5-6 fights in a year. And I believe he ended up with 2 this calendar year. He's a really fun fighter to watch, Gael Cabrera. He's training with Johnny Cañas and Alexis Rocha now, out in Santa Ana, California. He improves to 6-0 and landed a knockout victory over Garen Dagan, who had a 10-5 record going into this, now 10-6. Really, really good talent, up-and-coming talent. I think as it relates to young fighters that are developing and coming into their own, I think Golden Boy and Top Rank are probably the 2 best organizations at the moment that are developing the most youth and have the most promise for years to come. Top Rank by way of signing amateur standouts and Olympic fighters. And Golden Boy gets a lot of the national champions and up-and-coming fighters, national champions from other countries from around the world. And a lot of the young fighters, they often get overlooked, like a Gael Cabrera, who was a multinational champion and or multi-time champion for Mexico. You had 17-time champion in... Wow, I'm so spastic right now. But I will get you. And I had an interview with him as well. He trains out of California also. And I got to talk to him. Why is his name leaving me? He was on the undercard of Cepeda and Giovanni Cabrera. Joel Iriarte. So that young fighter, 17 national titles when I talked to him. Very impressive, very humble, very good story behind him. And Joel Iriarte is one of those fighters. He's 5-0, 5 knockouts. He's one of those fighters. He was actually on the undercard of Floyd Schofield, and I didn't get a chance to catch up with him. But he's one of those fighters that has a lot of promise to him and has a very high pedigree, just like Raul Curiel for the Mexican national team, being a representative of that team. Joel Iriarte is one of the reps for the U.S. 17 national titles, something like that, something insane. He's a talent, and he campaigns at welterweight as well. He's a talent that a lot of people are overlooking or maybe don't know about, that they will if he continues on this trajectory. So I'll leave you guys with that. This was a lengthy episode, but a necessary one, because we just covered not just another one of the events that took place this past weekend, but how it affects the welterweight division and the current standings within the welterweight division. Not much movement between these two fighters, Alexis Rocha and Raul Curiel, aside from on their personal level and the marketability. This fight, this presentation that they gave of one another, that ends up in a draw professionally on the records, it paid huge dividends for them personally and in their respective careers, because of the way that they fought, because of the presentation that they put, the show that they put this past Saturday. So I hope that if they don't run it back, just to recap, if these two don't run it back in the first quarter of 2025, then let's hope that they will get a shot at the respective champions in their organizations that they're representing. Alexis Rocha representing the WBO by way of the NABO title, and Raul Curiel representing the WBC by way of the North American title. That would lead Curiel towards Mario Barrios and Alexis Rocha towards Brian Norman. So very, very interesting the way that the welterweight division is playing out. I'll leave you guys with that. Plenty more boxing coming your way. Big week for the sport of boxing, as we are days away from the rematch, the big rematch, and potentially the biggest card of the year. Definitely the biggest card to close out 2024, and that is between Usyk and Fury, as they get to run it back out in Riyadh, and we'll be covering that as well. So I'll leave you guys with that. Plenty more boxing coming your way, and thank you guys again for tuning in. Have yourselves a great night.